The fluorescent lights of Terminal C buzzed overhead as Sarah Martinez watched in horror, while two TSA agents flanked her 8-year-old son, their hands resting ominously on their radios. Miguel's small body trembled in his wheelchair, tears streaming down his face as the commotion around him grew louder and more frightening. The gate area, which moments before had been filled with the usual pre-boarding chatter, now pulsed with tension and whispered conversations. "Ma'am, you and your family need to come with us," Officer Davidson said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the busy airport. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked from her son to her husband Carlos, who stood frozen beside their carry-on bags, his face a mask of confusion and rising panic. Behind them, passengers craned their necks to get a better view of the unfolding drama, some recording with their phones, while others shook their heads in disapproval. Just 30 minutes earlier, the Martinez family had been settling into their seats aboard Flight 447 to Boston, where Miguel was scheduled for a critical consultation with specialists at Children's Hospital. The appointment had taken months to secure, and the experimental treatment could potentially change their son's life forever. Miguel, born with a rare neurological condition that caused involuntary vocal outbursts and muscle spasms, had been having an particularly difficult day. The stress of travel, the unfamiliar environment, and the anticipation of another medical procedure had triggered a series of episodes that manifested as loud crying and what appeared to other passengers as disruptive behavior. Sarah had been doing everything she could to comfort her son, speaking to him in the soft, rhythmic Spanish phrases that usually calmed him, while Carlos had been unpacking Miguel's sensory tools from their carefully organized bag. They had flown before, always with a letter from Miguel's doctor explaining his condition, and while they occasionally received curious looks, they had never encountered outright hostility, but today felt different from the moment they had boarded the plane. The woman in seat 12A had made her displeasure known immediately. Blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, designer handbag clutched protectively to her chest. She had turned around multiple times with increasingly dramatic sighs and pointed stares. When Miguel's crying intensified as the plane prepared for takeoff, she had stood up abruptly, her voice cutting through the cabin like a knife. "This is absolutely unacceptable. I paid good money for this flight, and I shouldn't have to listen to this noise for the next 3 hours." Sarah had felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and frustration. "I'm sorry, but my son has a medical condition. We're actually traveling to see his doctors." The woman, who would later identify herself to authorities as Mrs. Patricia Whitman, had rolled her eyes dramatically. "Medical condition. He looks perfectly fine to me. This is just poor parenting, and I won't stand for it." What happened next would haunt Sarah for months to come. Mrs. Whitman had pulled out her phone and, speaking loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear, had dialed 911. Her voice took on a tone of manufactured urgency as she spoke to the dispatcher, claiming there was a potential security threat on the plane involving an uncontrolled child who might be dangerous to other passengers. "I need to report a security situation on American Airlines Flight 447, she had said, her voice dripping with false concern. "There's a child on board who's completely out of control, screaming and thrashing around. The parents seem unable or unwilling to manage him, and I'm genuinely concerned for the safety of everyone on this flight. Something isn't right here." The implications of her words were clear to anyone listening. She wasn't just complaining about noise. She was suggesting that Miguel posed a danger, that his parents were somehow negligent or suspicious. The coded language of her complaint carried weight that would soon mobilize an entire airport security response. Within minutes, the plane's captain had received word from ground control that there was a security concern in the cabin. Flight attendant Jessica Wong, who had been working for the airline for 12 years, approached the Martinez family with obvious reluctance. She had seen Miguel's medical documentation during boarding and had been quietly supportive, even bringing him a coloring book from the children's activity kit. "I'm so sorry," Jessica whispered to Sarah, her eyes reflecting genuine sympathy. "Ground control is asking that your family disembark while they investigate a passenger complaint. This isn't my decision, and I want you to know that I think this is completely wrong." The walk off the plane felt like a perp walk. Other passengers stared as Carlos pushed Miguel's wheelchair down the narrow aisle, the little boy's sobs echoing in the confined space. Sarah carried their bags with shaking hands, her mind racing with the implications of what was happening. They had comprehensive travel insurance. But would this incident affect Miguel's medical appointments? Would they be banned from flying? The questions multiplied with each step toward the jet bridge. Mrs. Whitman remained in her seat, arms crossed with satisfaction, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she watched the family leave. She turned to the passenger beside her and said loudly enough for others to hear, "Finally, someone taking action. You can't just let people disrupt everyone else's travel because they claim their child has problems." Now, standing in the gate area under the harsh fluorescent lighting, Sarah felt completely exposed and vulnerable. The TSA agents were joined by 2 airport police officers, their presence drawing even more attention from curious onlookers. Miguel's condition was worsening under the stress, his crying becoming more intense and his muscle spasms more pronounced. Each sob felt like a knife in Sarah's heart, not just because of her son's distress, but because she knew that his symptoms were being misinterpreted as defiance or manipulation. Officer Davidson consulted his notepad, reading from the complaint that had been phoned in. "We received a report of a potentially dangerous situation involving an uncontrolled minor and possible child neglect. The reporting party expressed concerns about the safety of other passengers." Carlos stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Officer, my son has a documented neurological condition. We have all his medical paperwork right here, including a letter from his neurologist explaining his symptoms and our reason for travel." He reached for their carefully organized folder of medical documents, but Officer Davidson held up a hand. "Sir, I'm going to need you to keep your hands visible while we sort this out. Right now, we're responding to a legitimate security concern." The word legitimate hit Sarah like a physical blow. There was nothing legitimate about what was happening to their family. Miguel wasn't dangerous. He was sick and scared and surrounded by strangers who didn't understand his condition. She knelt beside his wheelchair, ignoring the officer's watchful eyes, and spoke to him in the same soothing voice she had used since he was a baby. "Está bien. Mi amor. Mamá está aquí. Todo va a estar bien." Her words seemed to calm him slightly, but the damage was already done. The overstimulation and stress of the situation had triggered a cascade of neurological responses that wouldn't easily subside. A crowd was gathering now, other passengers from their flight, mixing with travelers from other gates who had heard the commotion. Cell phones appeared, recording the interaction between the family and airport security. Social media would later play a crucial role in what happened next. But at that moment, Sarah felt only the crushing weight of public scrutiny and judgment. TSA Agent Rodriguez, who appeared to be the senior officer present, took charge of the situation. "We're going to need to examine your documentation and speak with the child separately to assess the situation." "Absolutely not," Sarah said, standing up with newfound determination. "My son is 8 years old. He has a disability that affects his communication, and you are not separating him from his parents based on some stranger's complaint." The tension in the gate area was palpable now. Other travelers were beginning to murmur among themselves, some expressing sympathy for the family, while others seemed to side with the idea that disruptive passengers should be removed, regardless of the circumstances. The division in public opinion was playing out in real time, creating an atmosphere charged with competing emotions and perspectives. Meanwhile, back on Flight 447, something extraordinary was beginning to unfold. Captain Michael Torres, a 20-year veteran pilot with American Airlines, had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit. Initially, he had followed protocol, allowing ground security to handle what had been reported as a passenger disturbance. But as he watched the scene through the aircraft windows, something about the family's treatment troubled him deeply. Jessica Wong approached the cockpit with a look of distress on her face. "Captain, I need to speak with you about the family that was removed. I saw their medical documentation during boarding, and this whole situation is completely unjustified." Captain Torres invited her into the cockpit, away from passenger ears. Jessica quickly explained Miguel's condition, showed him the medical letter the family had presented during boarding, and described how Mrs. Whitman had deliberately misrepresented the situation in her 911 call. "That little boy wasn't being disruptive by choice," Jessica said, her voice tight with emotion. "He has a neurological condition, and his parents were doing everything they could to help him. Mrs. Whitman knew this, but she called the police anyway and made it sound like they were a security threat." Captain Torres felt his jaw tighten. As a father of 3, including a daughter with ADHD, he understood the challenges that families with special needs children faced when traveling. He also understood that his decision in the next few minutes would have consequences that extended far beyond this single flight. He picked up the phone to call ground control. "This is Captain Torres on Flight 447. I need a complete briefing on the passenger situation that resulted in the removal of the Martinez family." As the details became clear, Captain Torres realized that a grave injustice was unfolding just outside his aircraft. The complaint had been filed by a passenger who remained on the plane, making claims that were contradicted by the family's medical documentation and the observations of his own crew. This wasn't a security issue. It was discrimination, pure and simple. Back in the terminal, the situation was escalating rapidly. Agent Rodriguez had been joined by a supervisor, and they were insisting on conducting a more thorough investigation despite the family's obvious distress. Miguel's condition was deteriorating under the stress, his crying becoming more intense and his muscle spasms more frequent. Dr. Amanda Foster, a pediatric neurologist who happened to be traveling through the same terminal, noticed the commotion and approached cautiously. She could immediately recognize the signs of Miguel's neurological condition and the inappropriate response it was receiving from airport security. "Excuse me," she said to Agent Rodriguez, presenting her medical credentials. "I'm Dr. Foster, a pediatric neurologist. I can see that this child is experiencing symptoms consistent with a neurological disorder, not behavioral problems. What you're doing right now is actually making his condition worse." Agent Rodriguez looked skeptical. "Ma'am, we appreciate your input, but we have to follow protocol when responding to security concerns." "What security concerns, Doctor?" Foster asked pointedly. "A disabled child having a medical episode. This is a healthcare situation, not a security threat." Her intervention began to shift the dynamic slightly, but the damage was already spreading. Videos of the incident were already being uploaded to social media, with hashtags like disability discrimination and airport shame beginning to trend. The court of public opinion was rendering its verdict in real time, and it was not favorable to the airport's handling of the situation. Captain Torres had seen enough. He made a decision that would define not just the rest of his career, but the lives of everyone involved in this incident. He opened the aircraft's PA system and addressed the passengers who were still seated, waiting for takeoff. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to address the situation that has delayed our departure. A few minutes ago, a family with a disabled child was removed from our aircraft based on a complaint from another passenger. After reviewing the situation with my crew and ground personnel, I have determined that this family was removed unjustly. The cabin fell silent as passengers absorbed his words. Mrs. Whitman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, suddenly aware that the captain's announcement was not going in her favor. The child in question has a documented medical condition, and his parents were traveling to Boston for specialized medical treatment. The family posed no security threat and violated no airline policies. In fact, they followed all proper procedures for traveling with a disabled family member. Captain Torres paused, choosing his next words carefully. As the captain of this aircraft, I have the authority and responsibility to ensure the safety and fair treatment of all passengers. Therefore, I am making the decision that Flight 447 will not depart until the Martinez family is returned to their seats and allowed to continue their journey to Boston. The reaction in the cabin was immediate and mixed. Some passengers began to applaud, while others grumbled about further delays. Mrs. Whitman stood up abruptly, her face flushed with indignation. This is outrageous. I made a legitimate complaint about a disruptive passenger, and now you're holding up an entire flight for one family. Captain Torres's voice came back over the PA system, calm but firm. Ma'am, filing a false report that results in the discriminatory treatment of a disabled child and his family is not legitimate. It's unconscionable. And yes, I am willing to delay this flight to ensure that justice is served. Meanwhile, word of Captain Torres's stand was spreading through the terminal via social media and word of mouth. Airport employees, other travelers, and even people following the story online began to gather near Gate C7, where the Martinez family was still being detained. The crowd was growing larger and more vocal in their support for the family. Airport Supervisor Janet Kim received an urgent call from her operations center. The situation at Gate C7 was becoming a public relations nightmare, with videos of the incident spreading rapidly across social media platforms. Major news outlets were already picking up the story, and the airport was receiving hundreds of calls from angry members of the public. Janet rushed to the gate area to assess the situation firsthand. What she found was a family in distress, a crowd of supportive onlookers, and a handful of security personnel who looked increasingly uncomfortable with their role in the unfolding drama. Most importantly, she found a pilot who was willing to ground his aircraft indefinitely until the situation was resolved fairly. Agent Rodriguez, what exactly is the nature of the security threat that warranted this family's removal? Janet asked, her tone suggesting she already suspected the answer. Agent Rodriguez consulted his notes again, but his explanation sounded increasingly hollow as he described Mrs. Whitman's complaint. The reporting party claimed the child was out of control and potentially dangerous to other passengers. And what evidence of danger have you observed? Janet pressed. The silence that followed was telling. Miguel was still crying, but he was clearly a frightened child with a disability, not a security threat. His parents were obviously loving and attentive, doing everything possible to comfort him despite their own distress. Dr. Foster's professional assessment supported the family's medical documentation. Janet Kim made the decision that should have been made an hour earlier. This detention ends now. This family has done nothing wrong, and they're going back to their flight immediately. But the situation was more complex than simply reversing a bad decision. The delay had caused the flight to lose its takeoff slot. Ground operations had been disrupted, and Mrs. Whitman was now threatening legal action against the airline for what she called discrimination against paying passengers who make legitimate complaints. Captain Torres, however, had anticipated these complications. He had already been in contact with air traffic control, explaining the extraordinary circumstances and requesting priority clearance once his passengers were properly seated. More importantly, he had documented everything, creating a paper trail that would protect both the airline and the Martinez family from future legal challenges. As airport security began escorting the Martinez family back toward their gate, something beautiful began to happen. The crowd that had gathered didn't disperse. Instead, they formed a corridor of support, applauding as Miguel's wheelchair rolled past. Some people offered words of encouragement in Spanish. Others simply nodded with respect and solidarity. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time since this ordeal began, they weren't tears of frustration and fear. They were tears of gratitude for the strangers who had stood up for her family when institutions had failed them. Carlos squeezed her hand as they walked, both of them overwhelmed by the unexpected display of human decency. Miguel, still overwhelmed by the sensory input around him, nonetheless seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. His crying began to subside slightly, and he reached up to hold his mother's hand as they approached the jet bridge. The scene on the aircraft when they returned was unlike anything the Martinez family had ever experienced. As they made their way down the aisle to their seats, passenger after passenger stood up to applaud. Some offered verbal support, others simply smiled warmly. But the message was clear. This family belonged here, and they were welcome. Mrs. Whitman remained seated with her arms crossed, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. She had expected vindication, but instead found herself isolated in a cabin full of people who recognized her complaint for what it truly was, an act of discrimination disguised as concern for safety. Jessica Wong helped the family settle back into their seats, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I am so sorry about what happened," she said quietly to Sarah. "I want you to know that many of us never supported this, and we're honored to have you and Miguel on our flight." Captain Torres's voice came over the PA system one final time before departure. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience during this delay. More importantly, I want to thank you for demonstrating the kind of compassion and understanding that makes air travel not just possible, but meaningful. We are all travelers on this journey together, and we're stronger when we support each other, especially those who face additional challenges." As Flight 447 finally pushed back from the gate, Miguel had settled into a calmer state, aided by his mother's soothing voice and the collection of sensory tools that Carlos had carefully arranged around his seat. The stress of the earlier incident was beginning to fade, replaced by the routine comfort of travel preparations. But the story was far from over. While the Martinez family flew toward Boston and Miguel's crucial medical appointment, their experience was igniting a firestorm of public attention and institutional soul-searching that would have consequences far beyond a single flight. The videos recorded by passengers during the incident had been viewed millions of times within hours of being posted. News outlets across the country picked up the story, framing it as a powerful example of both the discrimination that disabled individuals and their families face, and the difference that one person in authority can make when they choose to stand up for what's right. Captain Torres became an overnight hero, with airline pilots associations, disability rights organizations, and civil rights groups praising his decision to ground the flight until the family was returned. American Airlines, initially caught off guard by the publicity, quickly issued a statement supporting their captain's actions and announcing a comprehensive review of their policies regarding passengers with disabilities. Mrs. Patricia Whitman found herself in a very different position. Her identity had been revealed through social media investigation, and the public response was swift and unforgiving. Her employer, a luxury real estate firm, received thousands of calls demanding her termination. Her social media accounts were flooded with criticism, and she became the subject of numerous articles and opinion pieces about racism, ableism, and the weaponization of 911 calls against marginalized communities. More importantly, her actions had legal consequences. Making a false report to authorities carries criminal penalties, and the district attorney's office announced they were reviewing the case for possible charges. American Airlines also placed her on their permanently banned passengers list, a decision that was quickly adopted by other major carriers. The Martinez family, meanwhile, arrived in Boston to find a medical team that had followed their story and was prepared to provide Miguel with not just the specialized care he needed, but the emotional support the entire family required after their traumatic experience. Dr. Patricia Evans, the lead neurologist on Miguel's case, had worked with the hospital's media relations team to ensure the family's privacy while also using their story to educate the public about neurological conditions in children. Miguel's consultation went better than anyone had hoped. The specialists in Boston confirmed that he was an excellent candidate for a new treatment protocol that could significantly reduce his symptoms and improve his quality of life. But perhaps more importantly, the national attention their story had received opened doors to support services and advocacy groups that the family had never known existed. 3 months later, Sarah Martinez stood before a congressional subcommittee on transportation, holding a photo of Miguel smiling in his wheelchair. She was testifying in support of the Air Carrier Access Accountability Act, legislation that would strengthen protections for disabled passengers and create real consequences for airlines that discriminate. "My son didn't choose to have a neurological condition," she told the assembled lawmakers, her voice strong and clear. "But we did choose to seek the best medical care available for him, which meant we had to travel. What happened to our family on that day in the airport could happen to any family with a disabled member, and it's happening far too often." Her testimony was compelling, not just because of the injustice her family had faced, but because of the hope their story ultimately represented. Captain Torres, who had taken personal leave to accompany the family to Washington, sat in the gallery as Sarah spoke about the difference one person can make when they choose courage over compliance. Captain Torres didn't have to make the choice he made. Sarah continued, "He could have followed standard procedure and flown to Boston without us. But he understood that some things are more important than schedules, or policies, or avoiding controversy. He understood that standing up for what's right is always the right choice." The legislation passed with bipartisan support 6 months later, becoming known informally as Miguel's Law. It established new training requirements for airline and airport personnel, created clear procedures for accommodating passengers with disabilities, and imposed significant financial penalties on carriers that discriminate. Captain Torres received the Humanitarian Award from the Airline Pilots Association, but he consistently deflected credit for his actions. In interviews, he always emphasized that he had simply done what any decent person would do when confronted with obvious injustice. "I'm a pilot, not a hero," he would say. "I just refused to be part of something that was fundamentally wrong. Every day, we all have opportunities to stand up for people who need our support. The real heroes are families like the Martinezes, who face challenges most of us can't imagine, and still find the strength to fight for change that will help other families." Miguel's treatment in Boston was successful beyond everyone's expectations. The new medication protocol reduced his involuntary vocalizations by nearly 70% and significantly decreased his muscle spasms. More importantly, his confidence grew as he experienced fewer episodes in public, allowing him to participate more fully in school and social activities. The family story continued to inspire change in unexpected ways. Airlines began revising their training programs to include disability awareness education. Airport designers started consulting with disability advocates to create more sensory-friendly spaces for travelers with conditions like Miguel's. Even TSA modified some of their procedures to better accommodate families with special needs. Patricia Whitman faced a different kind of reckoning. She was ultimately charged with filing a false police report and sentenced to community service, which she was required to complete with a disability advocacy organization. The experience, according to court records, was transformative for her, though she declined to comment publicly about her change of perspective. Her former employer used the incident as a catalyst for implementing comprehensive diversity and inclusion training for all staff members. The real estate firm's CEO, Maria Santos, explained that Whitman's actions had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and discrimination in their workplace and their community. What happened to the Martinez family was a wake-up call for all of us. Santos said during a company-wide meeting that was later shared publicly, "We can't just assume that discrimination is something that happens somewhere else, to someone else. It happens in our communities, in our workplaces, and sometimes it's perpetrated by people we know and work with. We have a responsibility to do better." 2 years after the incident, American Airlines invited the Martinez family to be honored guests at their annual Safety and Service Excellence ceremony. Miguel, now 10 years old and thriving in his treatment program, sat beside Captain Torres at the head table, occasionally whispering questions about flying that the pilot answered with obvious delight. During his acceptance speech for the airline's highest humanitarian award, Captain Torres looked directly at Miguel and his parents. "I want to thank the Martinez family for teaching all of us what courage really looks like. It's not just about making a difficult decision in a moment of crisis. It's about facing challenges every single day with grace, determination, and hope for a better future." He paused, his voice catching slightly with emotion. "Miguel, your strength and your family's love have changed not just aviation policies, but the way thousands of people think about disability, inclusion, and our responsibility to protect each other. That's a legacy that will last far longer than any of our careers." The evening concluded with an announcement that American Airlines was establishing the Miguel Martinez Fellowship Program, providing funding for research into neurological conditions affecting children and scholarships for students with disabilities pursuing careers in aviation and aerospace. As the Martinez family returned home to Los Angeles that night, Miguel fell asleep in his airplane seat, his head resting against his mother's shoulder. Sarah looked out the window at the lights of the city below and reflected on how much their lives had changed since that terrible day in the airport terminal. The trauma of discrimination and false accusations would always be part of their story. But it was no longer the end of their story. It had become the beginning of something larger, a movement toward greater understanding, stronger protections for vulnerable people, and the recognition that ordinary individuals can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice. Carlos reached across the aisle to squeeze his wife's hand, both of them watching their son sleep peacefully. Outside, the airplane engines hummed steadily, carrying them home through the vast darkness, while below them, a country slowly learned to see disability not as a burden or a threat, but as simply another part of the beautiful, complex tapestry of human experience. The story of Flight 447 became required reading in many professional training programs, From airline customer service to law enforcement to emergency dispatch, it served as a powerful reminder that behind every policy and procedure are real people with real challenges, and that our response to those challenges reveals not their character, but our own. Miguel Martinez continued to fly regularly for his medical appointments, but now he traveled in a world that was marginally more understanding, slightly more accommodating, and significantly more aware of the barriers that disabled individuals face every day. His story had helped tear down some of those barriers, creating a legacy that would benefit countless other families facing similar challenges. And somewhere in the sky, on flights around the world, pilots and flight attendants and ground crews carried with them the memory of a captain who chose compassion over convenience, justice over protocol, and humanity over hierarchy. That choice, made in a moment of moral clarity, continued to echo through the aviation industry and beyond, reminding everyone who heard the story that heroism is not about grand gestures or extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes, heroism is simply about refusing to let a disabled child and his loving family be treated as anything less than fully human, fully deserving of dignity, respect, and the simple right to travel to seek medical care without being subjected to discrimination disguised as security concerns. The flight that began with tears and trauma ultimately landed in hope and transformation, proving that even in our darkest moments, there are still people willing to stand up, speak out, and ensure that justice takes flight.